Welcome to 20th Century Philosophy. Today we're going to talk about Wittgenstein on consciousness, because it's useful to think about what Wittgenstein thought was private, your conscious experience, in order to better understand why he thought language was not private. So we'll start with section 412, which is one of the statements that Wittgenstein makes on consciousness that's his clearest sort of statement. And what he says is, the feeling of an unbridgeable gulf between consciousness and brain process. How come that this plays no role in reflections of ordinary life? This idea of a difference in kind is accompanied by slight giddiness, which occurs when we are performing a piece of logical sleight of hand. And this giddiness I call philosophical vertigo, and I think it's a lot of fun, and that's one of the reasons I'm a philosopher. But for Wittgenstein, it's a sign that something's gone wrong. Philosophy's gone off the rails and has trapped you in a certain kind of language puzzle. When does this feeling occur in the present case? It is when I, for example, turn my attention in a particular way onto my own consciousness and, astonished, say to myself, this is supposed to be produced by a process in the brain, as it were clutching my forehead. But what can it mean to speak of turning my attention onto my own consciousness? There is surely nothing more extraordinary than that there should be any such thing. So when engaged in this paradox, we're doing something that's not ordinary. It's quite extraordinary to try to look at your consciousness. In fact, you can't do it. Just try. When you look at your consciousness or try to look at your consciousness, what you in fact are doing is just looking at what's external. You are kind of looking ahead, thinking about your consciousness, and you may start to look at the objects that you see in front of you that you're conscious of more as colors and shapes than as the external objects that they are. But you're still looking outside. You're looking at the objects of representation. You can't look at your consciousness. That's extraordinary. What I described with these words, which are not used in this way in ordinary life, was an act of gazing. I gazed fixedly in front of me, but not at any particular point or object. My eyes were wide open, brows not contracted, as they mostly are when I am interested in a particular object. No such interest preceded this gazing. My gaze was vacant, or again like that of someone admiring the illumination of the sky and drinking in the light. And here Wittgenstein seems to be describing this overall sense of consciousness, where focus shifts away from what is represented to the feeling of representing, simply being in the moment without thinking any particular thought or looking at any particular thing. And this is something that can happen. This is a kind of conscious state. It's more of a meditative state. You kind of imagine gazing fixedly and experiencing being in the moment as this contrast to staring fixedly at something and furrowing your brow in relation to that thing that you're trying to be conscious of or trying to investigate. And this sort of state generates the paradox because there are no features in common with brain processes. This kind of meditative state doesn't seem anything like a brain process. This sort of experience doesn't serve the ordinary function of getting us around in the world and engaging in our normal form of life. And meditative states may well be a form of life. It may be a kind of game that we play, maybe not a language game so much, but a kind of thing that serves a function, a kind of experience that serves a function. But what it is not the ordinary one, and certainly not the one that is involved in our standard forms of language games. And so philosophy generates this paradox by combining what an ordinary form of life is, that we understand what brain processes are, for example, by investigating them and seeing how they work, with this other kind of form of life, that involves meditation, that just doesn't seem to have anything in common with a meditative state. Note that the sentence which I uttered as a paradox, this is produced by a brain process, has nothing paradoxical about it. And here we see the difference between uttering it as a paradox in this mysterious sort of way and the way in which this sort of statement could be used non-paradoxically to participate in a normal form of language. And here is what it would mean. I could have said it in the course of an experiment whose purpose was to show that an effect of light, which I see, is produced by stimulation of a particular process in the brain. And this is what neuroscientists do all the time. They look at what's going on when people are having certain kinds of experiences, and then they look at the brain and they say, this is produced by a brain process. Look at how that goes. But I did not utter the sentence in the surroundings in which it would have had an everyday and unparadoxical sense. And my attention was not such as would have been in keeping with that experiment. If it had been, my gaze would have been intent, not vacant. So, meditative state, you're just kind of experiencing your consciousness, and then, how is that a brain process? The paradox. Or, looking at a brain, here's my brain, looking at a brain and saying, that's produced by a brain process. It's unparadoxical. That's the standard way in which we think about how things are connected in the world, what produces what, is involved in that kind of external investigation. Whereas when, we're combining different kinds of language games with consciousness and brain processes, then we get into the paradox and the puzzle.